All right, ladies and gentlemen, may I open what it seems to me a third panel, so it's not panel 2 as it's written in the... No, all right, now I got it. It's the second part of the second panel. Now, we have 3 presentations on our agenda. The first 2 will be delivered by our French colleagues, Professors Isabelle Davion and Frederic Dessberg, followed by Mr. Petr Kaleta of the Charles University in Prague. The first topic is the impact of the Soviet Revolution, or Russian Revolution, on the Polish cause from the perspective of the Western powers. Isabelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll try to stand between you and the nap. So, in the eyes of the Entente, the war was until 1916 a Franco-Russian topic. In 1917, it has become a Franco-British one. This is an evolution which had started in 1916 with the creation of the Inter-Allied War Council, but which was accelerated by the February Revolution. France's priority was the alliance with St. Petersburg until 1917, and if the defection of her eastern ally was a military catastrophe, it also, in the same times, offered the opportunity to clarify her positions towards Poland, to clarify it as insofar as possible, that is to say, to make moves and to take initiatives. For nor the French, neither the British were, at the beginning of 1918, in favor of dismembering Austria-Hungary. But if the different statements made until 1917 about the liberation of the Slavs were tactical, aiming at weakening Vienna, maybe prompting a separate peace, they became genuine attempts to find a solution for the Polish question in a democratic frame. Again, in January 1918, the 18 points were no less than ambiguous about the principle of nationalities. The text indeed mentions the emancipation of Italian Slavs, Romanian and Czechoslovak from foreign domination. But it was, in the minds of future peacemakers, an address to their supporters in Austria-Hungary, the target audience being Czech National Committee in particular. That France was the most important ally and Western supporter of the Polish nation after 1917 is not surprising, given the long-standing connections between Paris and the independence movement even years before the Great War. This support was particularly significant given the French ambition to create an eastern barrier or cordon sanitaire that would guarantee security for France and the whole continent. Among the other great powers, there are relatively few signs of a similar interest in the Polish files. If we take, for example, the Teschen question, it was only after the escalation of the conflict in spring 1919 that Great Britain, and to a lesser degree the United States and Italy, began considering the problem of Polish western frontiers. In fact, American and Italian delegates remained mostly on the sidelines when the issue was debated in the Allied councils and at the Conference of Ambassadors. I will come back to this example of Teschen to illustrate the different evolutions in Western positions regarding Poland during the year 1918-20, because this is a question which crystallizes the overviews and the hidden agendas. Great Britain believed longer than France did that an acceptable Russia could step back onto the international stage, and as a consequence, the British preserved this possibility during a long time. This position lent its full weight on the French leaders' attitude, as they were looking for an alliance with the Anglo-Saxons. What are the diplomatic consequences on the Polish question? The upsurge of Russian revolution in the international system was as violent and disruptive as had been the French Revolution in 1789. The first diplomatic consequence of the revolution is that France and Great Britain were freed from the Pact of London of September 1914, which obliged them to agree with St. Petersburg on the conditions of peace. Therefore, they could more or less openly set their aims of war within the framework of the 14 points, which has become the platform of the Entente programme for post-war Europe. In France, one of the political fallouts of the February Revolution was the revelation by the Russian revolutionaries of the secret agreement signed between France and the Tsar. In Paris, the chamber thus convened secretly in early June to discuss the country's war aims. The resolution adopted and publicized at the end of the debate rejected all thought of conquest. I'm quoting, but restated the goal of defeating Prussian militarism and the need to obtain solid guarantees of peace. Nevertheless, until spring 1918, the territorial promises of the Allies to the Polish leaders were made one at a time and did not imply that the Polish program was adopted as a whole. It was only once the treaties of Brest-Litovsk and Bucharest were signed that the Western perception changed. The very principle of the state rebirth of Poland was established for good, but the territorial issues were still to be solved. Among France's aims of war appears the spreading of the Republican ideology in all its given forms, freedom, justice, law. The collapse of Tsarist Russia allowed to clarify this point, for there was no more on the side of the Allies the most authoritarian and repressive regime in Europe. Since the French definition of Republican ideology included the people's right to self-determination, to advocate the Polish cause was to defend French aims of war. The situation once again changed considerably with the October Revolution, and the different parties at war toughened their stances anew. Encouraged by the Bolshevik Revolution and the possibility of a separate peace with Russia in the near future, Germany also toughened its viewpoints. In France, Georges Clemenceau's arrival in power in November 1917 and the support of public opinion put an end to the atmosphere of pacifism and pushed aside all possibilities other than victory, than total victory. Britain, too, took a tougher stance and for the first time notably demanded the return, for example, of Alsace-Lorraine to France when a peace agreement would be signed. Time had come to treat the Polish National Committee like a de facto government and study its territorial claims. This is how the Bolshevik Revolution, then the armistice of spring 1918, helped to clarify the positions. It became evident that the world would not return to the previous concert of Europe. And when the United States entered the war in April, again, once the Entente has become a Tsarist-free coalition, France and Great Britain were forced to take Wilsonian principles into account. The core of the Western position concerning the Polish cause at the end of the war can be synthesized by the Inter-Allied Declaration of the 3rd June 1918. We all know it, but I repeat, a Polish state united and independent with free access to the sea constitutes one of the conditions for a solid and fair peace as well as for the rule of law in Europe. I can't recall here all the negotiations between the Polish delegation and great powers about frontiers, but allow me a few words about the Teschen case. Concerning Poland's western border, France tended to support Polish interests. Invoking arguments favoring an economic and strategic balance between continental nations, Great Britain was more dubious. But the British were also keen to intervene as little as possible in the disputes of Eastern Europe, and for example, in Teschen, argued for a compromise that would yield a stable solution. Yet, if the French and the British attach wildly different importance to the question of Polish frontiers, the American position was even more distant. Lloyd George would later assert that the Polish Americans had tried to convince Wilson to speak out in favor of Poland's position on Teschen, but not only. Research in American archives has indeed highlighted Washington's general support for Polish claims, but has also shown how divided the American Commission to negotiate peace remained. On the one hand, US experts on Austro-Hungarian and Polish questions defended ethnic arguments. On the other hand, many US delegates favored political arguments which could modify arbitrations. Again in tension, they saw Czechoslovakia as a modern state, especially when it came to the treatment of minorities, and thus better suited to deal with mixed population areas. But at the end, this is the disastrous military situation of Poland facing the Red Army in July 20, which explained the Teschen division decided at SPA conference. First, the urgent necessity to shelter the coal mines in the Western camp, but also French strong hope that the Czechoslovak government, once satisfied in the Teschen question, will help the Polish army and lift the blockade on weapons destined for Poland. Let me say a few words about the military consequences. As I said, until spring 1917, the priority for the French leaders, in diplomatic as in military circles, was the alliance with Russia. Then, just a few days after the revolution had started, the then General Foch, declared that existed towards Poland a duty of solidarity in which the great powers cannot fail. This statement is made at an ethic level, but of course other factors, more pragmatic ones, are at stake. After 3 years of total war, France is worn out, almost 1.5 million deaths already, and must find fresh troops. So the Polish army in France was organized as soon as June 1917, an autonomous Polish army which served the cause of the Allies. It came under the control of the Polish National Committee in September 18 and placed under General Halle's command on the 4th October. It gathered at this time about 30,000 men, issued from various recruitments, a majority of prisoners of war from the German and Counter armies, but also volunteers from the United States, about 15,000 in total in 20. And from France, about 6,000. There was also a recruitment among Russian brigades, about 700 men, but both the French Minister of War and the Russian lobby in France were reluctant to use this source. Once the war has ended in the West, Marshal Foch decided to let this Blue Army join Poland as quickly as possible to protect the national territory. Regarding the spreading of the Bolshevik Revolution by the Red Army, the essential question for the Western powers was to fight or not to fight without any political plan, real political plan. The intent had sent troops to protect their ammunition depots in Siberia, but the tactical projection of soldiers actually fighting the Bolsheviks was a very delicate issue. In February 1919, Marshal Foch suggested to the Great Power that they establish a cordon sanitaire to contain Bolshevism. It implied to occupy Vienna and to watch lines of communication with Bohemia, Poland, and Romania. This plan did not meet their approbation. 1 year later, the entire Allied Council gathered and decided to guarantee its military support if, and only if, Poland was attacked within its legitimate frontiers, that is to say, the ones which had been recognized by the peace conference. Piłsudski was then confirmed in his idea that he had to act alone and help himself as far as eastern frontiers were concerned. The Western powers would rather see the Polish neighbors do the job. France in particular pretended to count on the help of Czechoslovakia. On its very first day, on the 21st October 1918, the Czechoslovak government had expressed its concerns regarding the Bolshevik threat and proclaimed that the Czechs would fight it by all means, adding that to the Poles we will give our moral, material, economic help. But in fact, in the context of the dispute over Teschen territory, Czechoslovakia rather repeatedly closed its frontiers, thus preventing military material from reaching Poland. The American delegate in Spa noted that it was a mistake to count on Czechoslovakia's help. The United States representative in Prague had unsuccessfully spoken to Beneš in June 20 in order to lift the blockade on convoys for Poland. As the Polish troops advanced in the west, French military circles were enthusiastic, which was not the case with the French political circles. The General Staff thus praised the offensive on Kiev on April 20 and the occupation of Ukraine in May. But if the French government did not encourage Polish operations in this area, it showed great interest in the fallouts in the oil sector. It was therefore determined to economically accompany the military occupation. In July, a Franco-British mission was sent to Warsaw with Dabenon, Jusserand and Colonel Weygand. The task was to evaluate the military situation and to give advice regarding future negotiations. Yet, unlike the British, France did not believe in the possibility of an armistice in the immediate future. This support without participation became untenable when Poland's very existence was jeopardized by the Red Army counteroffensive. But Great Britain remained adamant and advocated a dialogue with Chicherin. The director of the political and commercial affairs at the Quai d'Orsay, Philippe Berthelot, was in favor of solidarity with the British position because he was conducting a policy of entente with London. But the French General Staff kept trying to send arms and ammunition to Poland in spite of the British disagreement and Czech obstruction, I may add. But this technical assistance is the only room for maneuver of the French policy under the rule of the English nanny, as we said in France, la gouvernante anglaise. In fact, Lloyd George decided to open a conference with Bolshevik representatives in London, even though France's official line was still to avoid all contacts with Bolshevik Russia. On the 5th of August, Lloyd George stated in the House of Commons that if Moscow's answer to the British peace proposal were not satisfying, Great Britain should use all her influence on Czechoslovakia, Romania, so that they bring support to Poland. He was thinking material support, but MPs required assurance that Prague will not be forced to a military intervention. And Lloyd George chose to answer that if the Bolsheviks were on the verge to annihilate Poland, this was a perspective to face. I will end with a very brief presentation of the case of Eastern Galicia because it provides an echo chamber for all these problematics. Since the collapse of Tsarist Russia, the Quai d'Orsay has been advocating autonomy of Eastern Galicia inside Poland. Thus, Romania and Poland would share a common frontier that would provide a barrier between Bolsheviks and the rest of Europe. Piłsudski himself made sure to link in the minds of the Western leaders his fight in this region with a more global war against the Russian Revolution. This pattern was supported by the Polish delegation at the peace conference, of course, as well as by Marshal Foch. Poland is fighting for the Entente, not for her own frontiers. The Polish negotiators in Paris and Moscow in particular even suggested that Eastern Galicia had to prevent contagion between Russia and Slavophile Czechoslovakia. Archives show that Great Britain and America did not seem very convinced by this demonstration. But at the very least, the Poles worked to maintain a systematic link between Eastern Galicia and Russian Revolution. This is why they rejected the General Botha's proposal for an armistice in April 1919. The draft separated the Galician issue from the rest and followed the British plan for a plebiscite. Louis Nemi, a collaborator of Lloyd George's, who had spent his childhood there, rather suggested a kind of union with Prague. Sooner in March, when Lwów was threatened by the Red Army's advance, Foch asked the great powers to authorize a huge Romano-Polish offensive in Ukraine with the backing of the Haller Army and the Allied troops deployed from Odessa. The Anglo-Saxon refusal was positive. The Supreme Council had declared itself impartial on the matter of Eastern Galicia. So when the great powers discovered, when the British discovered that a part of the Haller Army was fighting in Eastern Galicia anyway, it was the General Ivaskiewicz divisions, Lloyd George was absolutely furious and accused the French of complicity. At the head of the Commission for Eastern Galicia, the South African General Botha suggested to threat to cut off Polish supplies. In response, General Leron, who was the French delegate at the Commission, asked Botha whether he was seeking to spread Bolshevism in Poland. Clemenceau, without any ambiguities, took the British side and published an official declaration stating that France was not supporting Poland in Ukraine and deploring that the Polish were under the false, or not false, impression that Foch stood with them. But just a few days later, the world situation shifted. The Bolsheviks were progressing through Volhynia, and the Hungarian Red Army had entered Slovakia. There was a huge risk of a junction. In addition of this danger, the American observers in the area had reported that the Ukrainian political forces were unable to govern Eastern Galicia, to their opinion. And the French officers, like the General Henry in Warsaw, kept assuring that the Polish troops needed to reach the Zbruch River. Lloyd George was, at this time, aware of all these circumstances and was also aware that the support to the White Russians was a dead end. On the 16th June 1919, the Western powers agreed that Eastern Galicia had to go to Poland, and 10 days later, they gave the Polish army, including the Haller Army, the authorization to occupy the area. So we can see how the Western powers had to adapt their initiatives toward Poland to the context of the Russian Revolution. And they had also, in order to adjust a firm position, to acknowledge the loss of Russia and welcome Poland as an essential ally. Thank you.
For this very interesting contribution, and we will have the next communication. Frederic, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, dear Professor. When Tsar abdicated in March 17, the Western powers had many interests to defend in Russia, and particularly regarding France, a preeminent and economic and commercial position. For the French government, for the British Empire, and soon for the United States, the most important stakes were to keep the Russian Empire fighting among the Entente, to reinforce the Russian military capacities, and to rely on Russia's support on the Western Front. At the same time, the Allied powers began to put forward the topic of the self-determination of the peoples. At first, the French behavior about this remained very ambiguous, especially regarding the autonomy and independence of Poland. The weight of the French-Russian alliance is the best explanation for the modest French support to self-determination of Poland. It is pertinent to underline both the influence of the Russian Revolution and the Polish national issue, because from 1917 to 1921, France and her allies have moved in assessing revolutionary Russia and the borders of the new Polish state. They have moved sometimes in the same way and sometimes divergently. The perspective of a social revolution and, above all, German military threat has accompanied this development. My first point regards the short period from February to October 1917, during which France hopes toward the early Russian Revolution something good to happen and was rather shy towards the Polish cause. The French political circles were firmly convinced that the French-Russian alliance had to be developed in order to keep Russia away from the German influence. The fall of Tsarism was good news in the narrow French and political spectrum of the peace movement and of the socialists. The pacifist socialists who refused to approve war credits were the only to be publicly enthusiastic about a social revolution intended to spread in Europe. Yet, the Western revolutionaries were to show satisfaction toward February Revolution. In France, in spite of negative in spite of negative calls at the Quai d'Orsay, coming particularly from Maurice Paléologue, the French ambassador in Petrograd, positive statements could be heard. On 21st of March, Paul Deschanel, president of the chamber, offered deputies ardent and brotherly wishes in a context of overall enthusiasm. He showed particular insistence that Russian armies continue to fight until the final joint victory. Behind this official speech was hidden a real concern towards Russia's abilities to act like an ally. Besides, newspapers would echo new possibilities that were offered to new democratic Russia to keep on fighting, since the allegedly pro-German Petrograd's court had collapsed. This was the case of the French Minister of Armament, Albert Thomas, who was sent to Russia in April 1917, along with Arthur Henderson, socialist member of the British War Cabinet. They both supported the Russian provisional government. It was the same for the French parliamentarians, Marcel Cachin, Marius Moutet, who have been sent by the Committee of Foreign Affairs of the Chamber. Their parliamentary mission report had been delivered in June 1917 during a secret committee. It emphasized Russia's capacities and willpower to keep fighting with the intent. In order to convince the Assembly, Moutet insisted on the exhortations of the delegation members who had gone as socialists and as a Frenchman to continue the fight against Germany. Cachin criticized Lenin's arrival to Petrograd inside a sealed rail car, and he explained that not only the Russian provisional government would not seek a separate peace, but also that revolution was the safest guarantee to avoid Russia from failing. The revolution was not only social, but also patriotic. Therefore, the fall of the Tsarist regime was perceived as a positive development in the political circles. It represented also an opportunity to favor the principle of self-determination regarding the Polish claims. Before the February Revolution, the French government avoided offending the Russian imperial government, and the politicians who demanded a really Polish Poland, like Édouard Herriot, were conspicuous exceptions. The French cabinet actually agreed with Prince Lvov's declaration of independence of Poland, of Poland in March 17, but Paris remained very cautious about it. Alexandre Ribot, president of the council, gave up any claim about recovered Poland for fear that the Russian declaration was beneficial for the Central Empires. Only from May 17, France resolutely supported the building of a new Polish state while favoring the National Polish Committee and supporting the establishment of a Polish army in France. It is worth to notice that at the same time, the Russian provisional government had refused the establishment of a Polish army in Russia. To summarize the way the political and military leaders received the Russian Revolution at this moment, we could say that it was welcomed, but that the Russian government was reminded to honor its commitments. Nevertheless, the Western perception of events in Russia was to become very soon hostile due to the worsening of social crisis in the West and due to the Bolshevik Revolution, which preceded Russia's withdrawal from war. So what was the situation in the last month of the Great War. The political divide regarding Russia became obvious only when the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd. The revolutionary aspect of the October events was not clearly visible, and it was often perceived as a takeover in the press. Following this, diplomatic rupture occurred. It was at first mainly due to communication difficulties, but it became more effective when Russia and Germany signed armistice in December. The new French president of Conseil, Georges Clemenceau, in concert with his British counterpart, David Lloyd George, then defined in which Russian areas Western military interventions could be conducted. Contrarily to Lloyd George, Clemenceau was not prepared to maintain official relations with the new Russian regime. However, during the last weeks of 17, the French government was advised not to show too much hostility toward the Soviet rule in order to encourage Russia to remain at war against Germany. The first grievance against the Bolshevik Revolution appeared during this period among the political and military circles. Peace between Russia and Germany meant cooperation between them. Because of the peace negotiation between Russia and Germany, the Russian revolutionaries extended their power in the northern part of the empire's former territory, while the French and the British allies, along with their American associates, agreed on extending around Russia the naval blockade already set up against Germany. However, the Western powers showed different attitudes. Woodrow Wilson and his Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, agreed with the extension of the naval blockade. They refused any help for the Bolsheviks against Germany, precisely because they feared the extension of the revolutionary ideas. On the contrary, in the early weeks of 1918, even if the Russian government was negotiating peace with Germany and had cancelled the Tsarist debts, Lloyd George wished to provide support to the Bolsheviks in order to make them fight the Germans. But his cabinet and the Foreign Office were against him. In France, General Foch was prepared to the idea of a military assistance to Russia, but the French diplomacy was unfavorable to it. In the end of February 18, Leon Trotsky had asked for the participation of the French military mission in Russia in the organization of the newborn Red Army. Foch had accepted it. He had accepted the request, but this military cooperation never saw the light of the day. Meanwhile, the political circles, among them left-wing parties, found a political guide to follow in President Wilson's 14 points regarding self-determination of the peoples and public diplomacy. A majority of the French socialists firmly opposed to the Bolshevik Revolution, but they had to counter the main part of the political spectrum which justified the practices of secret diplomacies and the satisfaction of territorial claims for the benefit of France and her allies. In this situation, a new Polish state began to be considered as a bulwark against Germany. The idea appeared as soon as November 1917 in the French diplomatic documents. In January 18, Lloyd George demanded ethnic borders for the future new Polish state. After the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, the French supported the idea of Wilson, and Wilson agreed because it was implied from his 13th point. The Allied powers soon agreed with the idea of leaving the leadership of their policy towards Poland to the French, but they shared different viewpoints on it. Paris had approached the Soviets because of the Brest-Litovsk negotiation and amid concerns that the dislocation of the Russian Empire could help Germany. We must remember that at this moment, Poland had no army. In the same time, Lloyd George feared isolation of Russia. Anyway, the signing of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty had strengthened the position of Poland in the Allied policy. The French High Command definitively saw essentially Lenin and his supporters as revolutionaries bribed by Germany. In September 18, Poland became a belligerent ally, and in February 1919, the Polish Blue Army became an integral part of the Allied forces, while France acted to help, I quote, the Polish state to be freely established and sheltered from external enemy interventions. Following November 18 armistice, Bolshevism issues completely, or rather completely, lost their military aspect to become political. But for the French military, particularly Foch, at the head of the Allied forces, the threat of a German-Russian alliance was added to the revolutionary danger. At the beginning of 1919, Foch submitted to the Allies the idea of an Allied massive intervention in Russia, combined with the creation of a barrier of states separating Germany and Russia. At the same time, he supported the Polish aims of annexation in eastern Galicia, you heard it, notably in order to stop Red Army's progress. According to the French former ambassador in Petrograd, Joseph Noulans, France was declared in a state of war against Bolshevism. As the Allied massive intervention was impossible, it became necessary to arm Poland and the countries of the Eastern Barrier. We enter in the period of the cordon sanitaire, and it will be my third and last point. The Allied intervention in Russia triggered reticent reaction in the Western public opinion, it had been said, among the soldiers. The socialist circles were trying to obtain explanations on the purposes of war and to figure out whether or not France and Great Britain were at war against Russia. Moreover, the motives of intervention in Russia were not really up to date. For instance, avoiding German possibility to gain forces to turn to the West. In June 1919, the debate on whether or not French troops should be sent to Russia was intense when the French fleet evacuated Odessa. Moreover, the Russian Revolution was mostly perceived as an extension of chaos. The issue was addressed in terms of domestic policy in the course of 1919, in England as in France, in an economic context of expensive life and serious shortage. It was also marked by the expression of strong demands from the workers. The Reformist Socialist Party lost ground to growing minority of the Russian Revolution supporters. From January 1919 onwards, while revolutionary movements were spreading across Germany and Hungary, this minority served as a reference for those who triggered social protests. In France, the socialists were on the verge of breaking down. That is why they adopted a revolutionary program. This electoral strategy resulted in isolation and defeat when the ideological debate became more intense. After the Third International was created, thus, from 1917 to 1919 and even later, the political and military circles have seen the Russian Revolution through the glasses of the German threat and of inner political concerns. There is no time here, only 5 minutes, for a description of the Allied intervention into the Russian Civil War, which happened to be negative. The French General Staff expressed disappointment with the action of the Whites in Ukraine. So, as a foreign policy actor, the French military were eager to support Poland. In December 1919, during the last days of his government, Clemenceau, who was also Ministry of War, explained to the Allies that he was against spending more money on military interventions and that he wanted instead to put a belt of barbed wire around Bolshevism and to assist Poland, who was waging war against Russia. He added that he was much more concerned about Germany than about Bolshevism. Lord George wanted to achieve an agreement with the Soviets and, if the French agreed, lead the Poles to negotiate with Russia. Simultaneously, in early 1920, Alexandre Millerand replaced Clemenceau and Paléologue became Secretary General of the Quai d'Orsay. He was favorable to a French support to the Pole, The French diplomacy, it has been said by Isabelle, was divided, and it became then more ambiguous. Moreover, it partly differed from the British diplomacy and from the point of view of the French General Staff. During this time, Joseph Pilsudski, who wanted to launch an offensive against Moscow, had to act quickly and to get at least French support while complaining about the British abandonment. But encouraging Poland to launch an offensive was a thing the French diplomacy could not do when Lloyd George wanted to facilitate an accommodation with the Bolsheviks. So Paris only encouraged the Poles not to give in to the Russian demands and subsequently not to choose between war and peace at the beginning of 1920. In the early April 1920, when the Soviet-Polish negotiations have broken, the French General Staff criticized the offensive because of the risk of a German danger in the case of a Polish military misfortune. But the French government criticized the offensive only afterwards. In spring, the French military mission in Poland helped the Polish army by developing plans, but the French support became stronger during July when the military situation of Poland became critical. The facts are known, so I don't develop this point until the moment when the French and British diplomatic and military mission has been sent, including General Weygand, sent to Poland in order to keep the Allies informed of the situation, to press the Polish government to give its policy with regard of the Allies, and to separate Pilsudski political and military power. At this moment, Millerand's position has changed a little. After having shared Lloyd George's reproaches toward Pilsudski, he had refused the British advice to conclude an armistice between Poland and Russia. According to Paris, but to London as well, it was about defending Poland against the Bolshevik attack, but also to convince Warsaw to be moderate regarding territorial conquest. It had not been possible to build a united front in relation with Wrangel's army against the Red Army, as it was expressed by the French Minister of War on 8th of August 1920. It is a limited offensive to take against the Bolsheviks. We enter in Germany if she moves. We understand that the bordering countries do not feel eager with this operation. It is because they cannot see well their vital interests. These people have to form a coalition against their common enemy. After the Polish victory on the Vistula, Paris wished to postpone talks between Warsaw and Moscow in order to resume contact with Russia under Wrangel's control. And when the Treaty of Riga was signed in March 21, France refused to guarantee the new Polish-Russian borders. Always the same cautiousness. To conclude, the Allied policy in Russia seems to have been inconsistent, mainly because the support to the White troops and the military assistance to Poland have been weak and met simultaneously with the cautious will to establish the cordon sanitaire. But it is possible to find some continuity in the action of the Western powers, protection of the national interests. The Western and even French policy remained on the defensive and was led by the will to guarantee further relations with a future post-revolutionary Russia. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this contribution. And now, the last participant of this panel, Mr. Petr Kaleta, małe grupy etniczne wobec przekształceń państwa rosyjskiego.
Mr. Petr Kaleta will speak about the small ethnic groups in light of the changes in the Russian state, using the example of Karaites.
Szanowny Panie Przewodniczący, Szanowni Państwo, teraz pójdziemy trochę o tej wielkiej...
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now depart from big international politics and we'll talk about a small religious and ethnical group, the Karaites. And in my presentation, I would like to show what the 1917 revolution had, what impact it had on the Karaim groups in the southwestern parts of Russia. For a very long time, they didn't have too much contact with the Tsarist Russia, and the situation changed in 1787 when 1783, I'm sorry, when Russia annexed Crimea. By doing this, most of the Karaites minority became part of Russia. When Poland ceased to exist after the last partition, the Karaite communes that used to be located in Poland became part of Russia. This was not a period of demise for them. On the contrary, as a small religious grouping, they were no threat to the interests of Russia, and that's why in Tsarist Russia they were not treated badly. At the turn of the 20th century, the Karaites were quite highly placed in the Crimean community. The February Revolution in 17 created good grounds for their establishment of their identity as a minority. The second government of the Crimean Republic was headed by one of the most important representatives of the Karaites, Solomon Solimovich. My presentation is about the activities of the Karaite community and about his person as well. It was at that time that they became fully-fledged members of the Russian community, the Russian society, and patriots, even though they preserved the Turkic language. Most of them, however, spoke Russian, and fluency in Russian was a precondition to get education. The Karaite community in Russia differentiated itself against the rest of society by having a very high average education level. After the outbreak of the First World War, the Russian Karaites supported their country. On the 3rd of August, Karaites and the religious authorities issued the regulation that every day until the end of the war, their Mass should start by praying for the Tsar and his family. At the same time, in the communities, a collection of funds was carried out for the Russian military. The February Revolution meant that the democratic ideas became very popular amongst all ethnical and religious minorities of New Russia. And the same pertains to the Karaites, who became very active in the cultural and political development of their community. Upon the initiative of Karaim Khrapshao, a new Karaite paper was published for the first time. The materials published in the different issues of this periodical are one of the basic sources for our research on the life of Karaites between 1917 and 19. In those papers, it can be seen that the Karaites wanted to use the democratization of the Russian life to develop their own ethnical and national aims. But they always want to do it as members and as part of the Russian state. They considered Russia to be their homeland. Starting from the first edition, they said Pole, Karaite, Russian or a Tatar are now all the sons and daughters of the same mother, the Great Russia. And their objectives were defined as follows. They said, brothers, we have to prove that we, Karaites, although we are not numerous, we still have the right for self-determination. We have our language, culture and art, and we can contribute with our original contribution to the treasury of culture. It was the first time in the history of Karaites that the preconditions were there for a Karaite political party. It was the National Democratic Party for Cultural Self-Determination. One of the main establishers was Simeon Salkiewicz-Ilashevich. The party became an important part of the Karaites' activities. It expressed the objectives in terms of culture and society. In many ways, they were in line with the Constitutional Democratic Party's aims, and the program of this new political party was then presented in the Izviestia. Karaites were considered to be a separate Turkic Semitic nation, but these issues were intertwined very strongly. And that's why religion was considered to be the historic foundation of the self-identity. They emphasized the union with the Karaites in Palestine and Turkey, as well as those living in Halich and Lithuania. In addition, they had the same ethnic origin. It was considered that the languages would be the Karaite language, the Hebrew for the Bible, and then the so-called Chaltai language, which is close to the contemporary Tatar language. Chufutkale and the surroundings were the origin, as were the lands given to the Karaites in Troki, as well as Łódzk, Poniewierzch, Halicz and other places, as well as the Kenes in Jerusalem. However, it was always emphasized that the Karaites were members of the Russian state, and it was emphasized that they had no separatist tendencies. The Eupatoria group emphasized their postulate to develop the Karaite identity. Let me quote now. They said, "We must become a nation. We must participate more in our cultural and national rebirth." As a result of the civil war, the party was not long-lived. Ilashevich, its main ideologist, left for Moscow in 1921, and he suddenly adapted his political views to the new conditions. Instead of continuing as a proponent of the national and religious independence, he switched his political views completely. However, that was more of an exception than a rule in the case of Karaites. I apologize, I've got some text about other institutions here as well, but let me just mention one very important person during the First World War. It seemed for a long time that in the First World War the Crimean Peninsula would remain relatively safe. However, the October Revolution meant that this was not the case. The consecutive changes of the government in the peninsula, the bloody civil war, made their situation much more complicated in the years 1720. Crimea became the hotbed of the civil war. When we talk about Karaite elites in Crimea, it must be emphasized that many Karaites held important positions in the local authorities as well as cultural institutions. One of these traditional Karaite families was the Krym family, and especially an agronomist and active member of the local community, Solomon Krym, was an eminent person. He was born as one of 12 children of a Karaite landowner. He was also mayor of the city in 1863 until 1880s. His father's name was Samuel Avlanovich Krym, and his mother was Ajite Hadjic. Solomon Krym was a very active person in many different areas of life. He was a member in many agronomist associations. He was also a member of the municipal board and participated in the Deodosia local council and the Gubernia Council. He was also known for his charity and support for sciences. He was a member of the National Freedom Party, and he was its head in Theodosia, and as a representative of the Gubernia, he was member of the last Duma elected from his area. He was an influential person, very much respected on the peninsula, as a result of which Solomon Krym had the opportunity to use his experiences and skills as one of the key representatives of the Crimean Constitutive Democrats, and he became the Commissioner for Agriculture. The Bolshevik coup caused significant chaos in Crimea. The Bolsheviks started strengthening their position there, using the bad economic situation prevalent at the time. Now, I won't discuss all the different Crimean governments. Let me move on to the second Crimean government, where Solomon Krym was a major personage. In October 17th, it became clear that the first government of the Crimean People's Republic was completely inert. In their wish to collaborate with the volunteer army, the candidature of Solomon Krym was proposed, since he was a very popular activist And this was then confirmed by the members of the Governorate's Council in in November. What was also important was that Solomon Krim was also very much respected by the Crimean Tatars, who considered him a candidate of their own. This was partly because the Crimean Tatars and the Karaites had many ethnical connections. In addition to being Prime Minister, he was also Minister for Agriculture and popular real estate.
His government emphasized its temporary nature, which should be the case until the next unification of Russia, which should become a free democratic country. The government has a task of guarding the interests of all the nationalities, especially the Crimean Tatars. I don't know how much time I have, so what is left in terms of the time is sufficient for the summary. Both revolutions, and predominantly the revolutions, obviated the development of the Russian state. For the Karaites and the nations of Eastern Europe, those events were of primary importance. It seemed that the democratization of public life would impact positively the Karaite culture and support the growth of their local statehood, which was intensively developing in the past decades, which also was paired by a religious self-identification. The revolution put it to a halt and dashed all hopes for the survival of the state. Especially the civil war affected pretty much each and every Karaite family. After Red Army marched into Crimea in November 1920, the Red Terror ensued, from which not only the soldiers of the volunteer army seek refuge, but also other minorities. Many important representatives of the Karaite population emigrated. In addition to, or apart from Karaite researchers, few remember the nationality of Solomon Krim and his role in forming the government. Most of its family emigrated mainly to the US and to France, but also they can be found in Germany and in the Czech Republic. Solomon Krim, that was forced to build up his new life from scratch in France, became a symbol for the population of the Crimea Peninsula, whom the political turmoil forced to flee the country. Thank you very much.
Proszę Państwa, w takim razie
All right, let us move swiftly to the discussion. I believe that our discussion can last up to 3 p.m., so over 20 minutes. Now, please feel free to ask questions or comment on what was said.
Ja chciałem się spytać pana doktora Kalety,
I wanted to ask Dr. Kaleta about the position of the Karaites in Russia. Were they regarded as middle class or high class or lower class? And moreover, how many of them were there? Okay, let's collect a few more questions.
A question to our two French colleagues. A hypothetical one. Sort of, if the miracle on the Vistula hadn't happened, how far would France be prepared to go in supporting Poland? Were there any sort of contingency plans in case, you know, the Russians move closer into Central Europe? What do we do then? Would they say, yeah, we'll let Poland go to ruin, or would there have been a massive intervention? Were there any sort of plans discussed in France? And to go with that, did the French in those years, 1919, 1920, make any big difference when they are dealing with Polish representatives? Whether they had been supportive of the Entente during the war, or whether they had actually been siding with the Central Powers. Pilsudski, of course, was ideal. He did both, but some of the others didn't. They were either one or the other. Was there any sort of difference made between those two groups?
Dziękuję. Proszę, pan minister, proszę.
Well, in 1920 and 1919, Pilsudski had a problem with the East. On one side, there were Bolsheviks, and everybody knows what they represented. But on the other side, there was also Denikin. And the problem he had was that Denikin denied, obviously, the independence of Poland and other things. He wanted to recreate Russia in 1914 borders. On the other side, Denikin heavily depended on the support from the Western powers, first of all from the British. Were there any attempts to somehow mitigate him in his ambitions? Because for Pilsudski, at some stage, he claimed that Denikin is a greater danger than Bolsheviks, and he released his pressure on Bolsheviks to allow Bolsheviks to come to fight Denikin. So was there any thinking that Denikin is something which is a problem which should be dealt with? Clearly, because of the fact that it was rather British, and you are from France, so maybe you are not the best people to ask this question. But knowing your knowledge, I hope that you will be able to shed some light.
Thank you. Proszę pani.
Ja mam pytanie do pana Kalety.
I have a question to Mr. Kaleta. The October Revolution was a class revolution, but you absolutely sidelined the class structure of the Karaite society. You spoke about Solomon Krim, who stems from bourgeoisie. And second question, how about the industry there? Was there an industry in that area? What kind of industry? What was dominant? Has there been any workers' movement there and similar issues? Could you please elaborate on that? Thank you. Someone from behind there. As we can see, Mr. Kaleta is most favored respondent. I have also a question to Mr. Kaleta. I'm very interested in Karaites. I have a question referring to the modern times. Karaites is an ethnic group that doesn't assimilate in terms of mixed marriages. They have their language, they have a religion, which is something of a mixture between Islam and Judaism. So, what is your evaluation of the circumstances in Poland? We say that the Karaite minority is the smallest one in Poland. statistics ranging between 50 and 240 individuals. So what is your take on the number of the Karaite minority in the 21st century? As a person who is interested in Karaite matters and of the 20th century, I can answer you directly that number of the Karaites are those which are in the, let's say, religious members of religious associations. The rest are the Karaites or people of Karaite origin living mainly in Wrocław. In the early 19th centuries, the Karaite national survival took place. So to what extent the refugees from the Soviet Revolution, from Crimea and so on, contributed to that revival? Now we have only a very small Karaite population. We have just a few Karaites in Poland, and there is no Karaite church in Poland. Thank you, Jacek Pruski. I wish first and foremost to say thank you to the French speakers, especially Professor Dessberg, for emphasizing the difference between the French and the British policies vis-à-vis Poland, especially before the Kiev surge of Piłsudski. You said that the French position was more, let's say, compassionate, but due to the British position, the French couldn't extend their support any further. Now, I have the question, when the offensive started, how was that when the offensive marked or saw its first successes, including the taking of Kiev? There was a brief moment where everybody surmised that it's going to be quite a success. I didn't investigate into the French documents, but in the British documents there was some sort of unrest in the British opinion. The missions were sent. So the French sent their mission. They are going to strike a deal, economic deal, about the exploitation of the new areas. Maybe we should also send a mission there. So could you shed light on the French take of the developments at that time? I have a short interjection that may be of interest to the last speaker, for the last speaker. Did you meet the name Simon Szyszman? He was the most prominent representative of this very small ethnic group, which had a possibility to grow and prosper in Vilnius, in Troki, and it was represented by Simon Szyszman, who is in fond memory of those Poles who lived in Paris, starting with the 1950s. He was a publisher, and he was connected to the École, a very famous one, and who indeed contributed to the strengthening. He contributes a confirmation of the Karaite literature, especially of the Polish-Lithuanian provenance. Any further questions, please? Can't see any. So I will just make a small comment to the previous speaker's papers.
Toward Poland, generally for dividing. First of all, the attitude toward Russia, the French vision of the future. The French vision of the future national non-Bolshevik Russia and Polish point of view, especially Marshal Piłsudski's point of view that Bolshevism is better solution from Poland because Bolshevik Russia will not be an ally of the Western powers. It was first factor. Secondly, the problem of the future of Ukraine in Polish point of view, it should be a separate and independent country allied to Poland. The problem of the relations between Warsaw and Prague, I mean the very complicated relations between Poland and Czechoslovakia. It was impossible to bring together both countries in this time due to different reasons. And last but not least, especially Marshal Foch was against Polish eastern expansion because it was contradictory to the necessity of the internal consistency of the newly recreated country. Was it only for these four factors or the other? What could you say in connection with this question? Thank you very much. And now, last commentaries of our panelists. There will be the end of this panel. Monsieur Dessberg, s'il vous plaît.
And for the elements of response you have given in the same times, maybe it's possible to only partially, I apologize in advance, to answer to the questions about Denikin's danger, about the French position of about Kiev, for instance, and the Polish offensive, and about the Battle of the Vistula. I think we must recall that in Russia, England, of Great Britain, or the British Empire, and France had economical and political objectives, and that in 1917, end of 1917, and until the beginning of 1919, and there is a very ancient but still very useful PhD thesis about this in France. The France and London and Paris had the wish to share influence zone, and the French zone was in the southern Russia and Ukraine. So from this moment, it was interesting for the French to gather the Russian forces. And Denikin's case was different. As you said, the British were much more concerned. And the French deception came from the fact that it was rather impossible to gather Polish and the white forces because Piłsudski never wanted reconstituted former Russia, as Marek said it just at the moment. So if there was a problem between Piłsudski and Denikin, there was also a problem between Piłsudski and Wrangel, of course, and even Kolchak, and not speaking of Petlura and others. When the French offensive, when the Polish, excuse me, started in April 1920, we can see from the French position two kinds of reactions. As I said, the military reaction was negative from the beginning because it was very dangerous. The main problem with the Bolshevik Revolution were the link with Germany, and the military intelligence was always looking for documents, information about a complicity, a collusion between Germany and Russia. And when you find something, when you are looking for something, you find it. And they found a lot of things, even if it was just an idea. After 1920, 22, it was real clear, but they wanted to find this for 1919 and 1920. So categorically, the French military men, the French general staff was against before and after the offensive. It's not quite clear for the Quai d'Orsay, for the French diplomacy, because from one side you had the Secretary General Paleologue who wished the reconstitution of Tsarist Russia, and other like Philippe Berthelot, as Isabelle said, who were against the idea. From the moment when it was impossible to join Polish forces and white Russian forces, it was extremely dangerous for the French. And moreover, a Polish defeat would have meant German and Russian collusion. So, new partition of Poland. You're right. So, what would have happened if the Red Army had invaded Poland, and if the Vistula battle had been a defeat for the Poles? In fact, during the few days or even weeks before the battle, for the British and for the French political and military circles, the defeat was announced. In fact, the victory was very surprising. And at this moment, what was interesting for the French military? Not to be involved with the defeat. That was the reason of not the French military mission. The French military mission was very criticized by the political and even by Foch, because General Henrys, the leader of the mission, was supposed to be devoted to Pilsudski's program in the East. But it was the French-British mission had to take power from Pilsudski's hand, in fact, and Weygand was supposed to manage this, and he failed. In fact, he was an advisor. You could find a lot of French officers like advisors, but the Poles remained the masters of the military thing. And a few days before the battle, the chief of the French General Staff, General Buat, wrote, "It's impossible for Weygand to separate military and political power from Pilsudski's hand, so he has to quit and to come back in France." After the battle, when the Poles won the victory, Buat wrote, "This is a victory, this is thanks to Weygand."
Yes. So quickly to let you room to answer. So to Mr. Hubert, France was reluctant towards Polish leaders because the Polish political representation often appeared abstruse and all the advices given by the so-called experts all the time did not help at all. So firstly, in 1917, there was a widespread suspicion among the French that leaders of the East Central European separatist movements were in fact Germany allies, to synthesize. And in 1918, the composition of the Polish National Committee gave also rise to reservation, with the exception of Erasm Pilz, whose presence was greeted by the French. He was our champion. In fact, the French were not very happy with the composition of the NPC and of the Polish delegation at the Paris Peace Conference. But they'd rather talk to Dmowski than to Pilsudski anyway. What I can say to sum up and give you the room to talk is the fact that the Polish representation was divided in two, without any doubt weakened the Polish cause at the Paris Peace Conference.
Szanowni Państwo, ja teraz nie wiem, ile czasu mamy? 5 minut, panie profesorze? Czy 7? Dziękuję za te pytania.
Right, thank you for those questions on the Karaites.
Przede wszystkim w 17 roku, dlatego to mnie...
Let me emphasize that the bulk of my presentation was about 1917, and that is why I did not discuss the structure of this ethnical group. Now, the first question was about the position that they held at the turn of the 20th century, and also during the First World War. And also there was a question about the number of Russian Karaites. Now, the first question also relates to your question about the structure of this ethnical group. Starting from the 1890s, the position of the Crimean Karaites was that there were many Karaites who were very well educated. Now, I mostly deal with Karaite emigration after First World War, and it was very clear in the people who moved to Czechoslovakia. Most of them, I'd say that maybe over 80%, were people who at least graduated from secondary school. I'm mostly talking about men. It was naturally different for women at the time, but even so, there were Karaite women at the very beginning of the 20th century who were very well educated. In the Tsarist Russia, and then after the February Revolution too, a lot of the Karaites held very important positions. For example, in the military, there were military doctors, there were engineers. So, if I were to compare the Karaites and the Russians, it's clear that the Karaites were much better educated towards the end of the 19th and in the early 20th century. Now, about the structure. In Crimea, they normally did gardening and agriculture. They also had some tobacco factories, although not that many, not as much as in other places. And there was a question about the number of Karaites and the population. Well, there are different sources, and as far as that Izviestie paper that I mentioned, there's information there that in 1917, in all of Russia, there were 14,000 Karaites. Now, when I discussed the Karaites, I was talking about the Eastern European Karaites. So I'm not talking about the Egyptian Karaites. I'm not talking about the Karaites of Jerusalem, which are separate Karaite groups. But here in Eastern Europe, there were 14,000 of them altogether, and 8,000 of them lived in Crimea. Now, in Trakai, in Lutsk and others, there were also smaller groups. The Trakai group was about 600 people. This information dates from 1890. Then there was a question about the contemporary situation of the Karaites. I don't know about the Polish Karaites. I'm not sure if you asked about Poland or Eastern Europe in general. It's very difficult to tell how many Eastern European Karaites there are, but it's between 1,000 and 1,500 more or less. Right now, there are about 150 Karaites in Poland. Now, according to the most recent census, it's about 320 or 350, but that's not true. You know that there were some problems with that census, and for example, people could enter their nationality twice, so the same person could tick both Polish and Kashubę, for example. So the actual number is that there are about 150 Karaites in Poland at the moment. Now about this rebirth of the Karaites before the First World War. I'd say that before the First World War and in the interbellum, there was a continuation of this rebirth, revival. And for example, the Myśl Karaimska, the Karaite Thought, was a popular science magazine that also popularized the Karaite question. Sarai Szapszała was an important character there, a very important character, and one of the most important Karaite ever, I believe. And he was the Khan of Poland for Karaites. So I think that that period was indeed very important for the Polish Karaites as well. And finally, Szymon Szyszman. Again, one of the best-known people in the history of Karaites. Apparently, when Professor Zajączkowski pointed out, Szyszman was also an author of a number of books, one of which was translated into Polish. He was a proponent of the Kazaki theory of the origin of Karaites. He mostly lived in France, by the way, but his biggest work was published in Switzerland. So that was another very eminent character. Thank you. Thank you. So this is it. Let's now take 15 minutes. And I would like to thank our panelists for participating in the panel.